All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is our regularly scheduled session for our hack sessions. So today will be about beginning to program, and we'll be going over the basics of, I guess, procedural programming. And for today, I'll be using PowerShell as an example. So I'm just going to wait a minute for everyone to get connected, so bear with me here for a couple minutes. For those who just connected, we're just waiting a couple minutes for everyone else to connect. Just bear with us here. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So this session for today is about programming, coding, and probably the easiest way to go through this stuff is to show by example. So for the examples today, I'll be using a scripting language called PowerShell. And PowerShell has been a language that's been around for about 10 years and very common on Microsoft Windows-based systems. But you can also use it on other environments such as OS X. And so the screen that I have shared is the PowerShell Ise Editor. And it's if you have PowerShell on your computer, you usually have the Ise Editor, so you can just go Start and just search for Ise. And you should have the program. So you click on it. By default, it will look something like, something like that. And so you have two basic screens. You have the command prompt. So this is where you can run your commands. So if I do 4 divided by 10, and I'll pipe that to a PowerShell commandlet called write host, which takes the an input and writes it to the command prompt. So we'll see we'll have the result of that operation here. The other view that we have is the script pane. So you can work with PowerShell from the command prompt, the PowerShell prompt, or you can work and write a file called a script and put your commands in there. And so I'm going to use that today to walk through the basics of working with a language. And in this language will be procedural. You can kind of divide most languages into one of two forms. So that's function-based, functional languages, or procedural. We'll leave the functional languages for another session, just focus on procedural. And procedural pretty much means execute a series of commands to change the state of the program. And by state means things like variables. And so I'll start going through PowerShell here as an example of some basics that will pretty much translate across most common procedural languages. I won't focus too much on PowerShell specific commands or things that are specific to syntax specific to PowerShell, but just try to talk about the universal aspects. So a few things. In a scripting language, you have your syntax, which is the accepted commands and the way that you write commands. So when learning a language, one of the first things that you want to do is to understand the syntax of that language. So to give an example, in PowerShell, if I want to write a comment, comment is a bit of text that isn't executed by the script. It's only there for people who are reading the script to be able to understand parts about the program that the author deemed necessary to write about. So for instance, at the beginning of this program, I've written some information about this script, so for other people who are running the script or editing the script, they can come and see some information about it. And in order to make sure this stuff isn't executed, I've used PowerShell syntax for creating comments. And there's actually two ways to create comments in PowerShell. There is this way to wrap up multi-lines. So we've got 1, 2, 3 lines. Or if we just have a single line, we can just use the hash. There's also commands and languages. Usually these are provided by libraries, built-in libraries or modules within the language. So you have some things like here we're issuing a clear to clear the command prompt when we execute our script. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little about variables. And a variable is essentially just a bucket, and we can put things in the bucket. Different languages handle variables a little bit differently. So there is strongly typed languages, meaning that if I make a bucket, I can tell precisely what should go in that bucket, and if something else goes in that bucket, I will get an exception or failure of some degree. But other languages are loosely typed, meaning that you can use a variable to hold many types of items. So what I mean by this, so for instance, I have a variable here, and in PowerShell, the syntax for a variable is $, and then the name of the variable. Actually, that $sign is a fairly common syntax that translates across a lot of languages. So in here, I tell PowerShell, the syntax here is to say that this variable is an integer. And an integer is just your standard numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 100, 9,000, 1 million, that sort of stuff. And so to find out what types of variables there are, you can just go online for your language and take a look at the types. So here I'm telling it make this variable as an int and assign it this value, which is 1. So you have variables and you have values. The value is what's contained in that variable, what's contained in that bucket. And the assignment operator, so this is the syntax for PowerShell to tell it put this value in this variable. And this syntax may change a little bit from language to language, but it's going to roughly be an equals of some description. The next line that I have is to say write host. And this is a PowerShell command that will output some information to the command prompt. And so my information is a quote where I write in some arbitrary information, and then it has my variable. So let's go ahead and run this. So it's going to output this bit of text that I wrote, and then it's going to output the value of the variable, which is 1. And let me just double check. Okay. So I'm going to go through some other types of variables, the most common types. And I'll move my comment blocks so that it's easier to see what's going on. Okay, so the next one is a decimal. And a decimal means like an integer, but you have a point. So you have like 1.2, 1.5, 1.9, 9.8, etc. So if I print this, we have our previous statement here, and then I have our decimal statement here, which is 1.2. And then let's go on to the next. Okay, so this one is a Boolean. So that's, if I just do this, spelled like that. And a Boolean is it's only allowed 2 types of values, true or false. And so for PowerShell, it has some built-ins in terms of specifying true or false. And it's either false like this or true. So if I run this, it's going to return true. Yeah, Booleans are a great way to control program flow, which I'll get into a little bit later, or to evaluate if something is true or not. The next item is a character, and a character is just a single letter. And essentially what this means is that it's an ASCII code character, and for instance, for this we've assigned it the letter A, and if we do varchar print that out, we'll get A. Now, where that gets interesting is that you can group characters together in another type called string. So in here, I've put in a single quote, or I could use double quotes. For most languages, it doesn't matter, but it's good to have both because then you can nest information. So for instance, if I run this, I still get string. And if I do this, single quote, you'll see that this gets nested within here. So if you need to be able to put in a quoted item within a string, then you want to put that in maybe single quotes. There's some flexibility in terms of how you do that. Okay. The next item is an array. And an array is essentially a group of variables. Or I'd say a group of values. Sorry, a group of values. So we have our variable, which is an array of type array. And it is an array of strings. So we've got the quotes. We've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And we can go ahead and print this out, and we get our Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. If you think about it, a string is actually an array of characters. So for these sessions, I won't go into the background of how variables work in terms of memory reservation and pointers and other computer science related topics like that. I'm just going to focus on the result of these commands and operations with a slant on scripting and programming for infrastructure. So there's a lot of information about arrays, and I'll leave that to another session. But just for the moment, just think of it as a grouping of values. And in most languages, it's kind of like a comma-separated list. The next item is a hash table. And the easiest way to think about a hash table is like a dictionary. And so you'll have two items. It's kind of like an array, but instead of having a series of values, you're going to have a series of keys and their associated value. So we've created a dictionary, a hash table, with two items in it. First item has a key of cat, and the key has the value of feline. And the second item has the key of dog, and the value of that is canine. So if we go to print out our hash table, in here I have the syntax where I can specify the key. So if I put in the key of cat, then I get the value associated to that key. So if I run this, here we have the value associated to that key, which is feline. And probably the last common type of type is an object. So an object is a kind of similar to an array. It's a grouping of variables and values, and also in certain languages you can associate functions to them, which I'll get into a little bit later. But for this purpose, let me just walk through what we're doing here. So the first thing is we're creating a variable, which is var user, and we are telling it to create it as an object of a certain type. So in PowerShell, you've got a certain type of syntax for creating objects. In other languages, how you declare or how you make this variable is going to change. But essentially, we've created an empty object as of line 34. In lines 35 and 36, we add members, or you could say we add properties to the object. So for var user, we essentially add a property called name, and we give it a value of Bob. Similarly, we also add another property called age, and we give it a value of 22. So when we go to write this out, I put in my custom text, and then I call the var user object, and I use dot notation to access the property. So what I mean by that is if I go to my object and I want to access its property, hit dot, and in ISE it will show you the available properties here. So I can click on name, or I could have just written out dot name. So I'll go ahead and run this, and you'll see here I've got user Bob. So user is my custom text that I wrote. Bob is the value associated to var user.name property, and I've got my custom text here and again 22 is the value of var user.age. So that kind of is a super quick tour of variables and types. And biggest thing to remember is that you've got two things. You've got a variable and you've got a value, and you assign values to variables. And in different languages, some may be strongly typed where you have to specify what the type is. Like here, we're specifying that var array is a type of array. Other languages, you don't have to do that. And in fact, in PowerShell, you don't have to do that. So, for instance, test, I can write a command here. And I can write the variable name that I want and use the equals to assign it a value. And the value is a string. So write host tests, one, do that, and I get hello. I can also use that same variable and assign it a Boolean. And it will overwrite the hello value that was there. So now if I do write host, and then I go test, I will get false. So PowerShell, I don't have to worry about typing my objects. It will handle it for me. It's smart enough to do that. But the problem is that the more intelligence that I rely on the language, the more I can get into trouble. So for instance, it may, if I go test is equal to 22, it's possible that it may interpret 22 not as an integer, but actually as a string. And so if you're relying on a program to work with it as an integer and it gets a string of 22, this could be a problem. So this is just something to think about. Whereas in a strongly typed language, you tell it precisely what type you want it to be, and it will avoid those types of errors. So just something to keep in mind. So just clear that out. So the next thing I'll go on to is arithmetic. So within your language, you can do arithmetic to compute information. So I'm going to explain this command. So this is my normal write host command to write to the command prompt. And this is just a bit of text to, when it writes the command prompt, to make it so that people understand what is being specified. Here I am adding 1 plus 2, so obviously this is going to equal 3. And I'm going to make sure that the program interprets the result of 1 plus 2 as an integer instead of something else like a string or anything like that. So when you specify the result of an operation like 1 plus 2 as a certain type, for instance integer, that's called casting. So I'm casting the result of 1 plus 2 as an integer. So if I go ahead and run this, we'll see down here, here's my custom text that I wrote, and I get the result 3 for 1 plus 2, and I get the result minus 1 for 1 minus 2. And I can use division, so I get 1 divided by 2 is 0.5, and similarly if I wanted to multiply, I could do 2 times 5, and what I'm doing here is using the pipe command. And the pipe command will tell this, take the value of this operation and send it to this command. So when I hit enter, it should write the output as 10, which I get. There's a couple ways to redirect information or pipe information. So the first one is the pipe, and this is when you want to supply some information as an input to a command. If you wanted to send the result of something to a file, so 2 times 5, and I can use the greater than symbol, and I can do this. So this is going to redirect the result of this operation, which is 10, and create, because this file doesn't already exist, it's going to create it, and then it's going to put that information in this file. So if I do that, and then I do a directory, I should see test.log here. And if I were to edit that file, I would see the number 10 in there. So just think, pipe, which is this key, is to redirect to, is to send the result of an operation as the input of a command. And the greater than is to send the result of an operation and redirect it into a file. So the next thing that I want to go into is to show how you can incrementally change the state of a variable. So for instance, I've created a variable called incremented. I've told it to create it as a type of integer, int, and I've given it the value of 1. The next thing I've done is I've written the variable name, and I put in plus plus. So plus plus is the syntax, and actually it's common across a lot of languages, to take the existing value and add 1 to it, and then reassign that result back to the variable. So in this case, it's going to take 1, it's going to add 1 to 1, which is 2, and it's going to store 2 in incremented. So when I write this out, I've got my custom text, and then it should display 2 here. So if I go ahead and run this, so 1 incremented by 1 is equal to 2. You can also, instead of just incrementing by 1, you can increment by arbitrary values. So for instance, if I want to increment by 5, it's going to, I've got this variable here, which is 1. It's going to add 1 to 5 and then assign the value, which the result, which is 6, back to the same variable. So if I run this, then I get 6. Just as you can increment, you can also decrement. So in this case, I have 1, and if I do minus minus, it's going to take that 1 and subtract 1 from it. So effectively, I get 0. So 1 minus 1 is equal to 0. This is in difference to say you could write these things out. So test1 is equal to 1, and you can do test1 is equal to test1 minus 1. And if I do right host test1, I should get 0. So you can see it's the same exact thing, but it's obviously a lot less typing. So it's just a faster way of doing the same thing, using minus minus or plus plus or plus equals. Different languages will have different ways to, you can do more than just adding and subtracting. So this is, so far, things have been fairly static within the environment. We go line by line, and we do run a set of commands, and nothing, the program will always execute the exact same way every time. But if we want to change the flow of a program dependent on certain things, then we can start using other commands. So I'll get into that now here. So for instance, an example would be a way to loop. So a loop means that we keep running over a set of commands until we're happy that something is done. So there's two different types of loops. There's a for loop, and for is a way to count, and it will loop through a set of commands as it counts. So for instance, there's 3 sections here in this for loop. So the first thing I do is I create a variable, and I assign it the value of 0. The next thing I do is I tell the for loop, run until this variable is less than or equal to 2. So less than or equal to, meaning that whichever comes first, it will satisfy. the next thing I do is every time this loop runs, every iteration of the loop, it's going to increment the variable by 1. So it starts out at 0, and in the first iteration, it's going to, after processing the command below, it's going to increment 0 to 1. And then it's going to iterate again, and then from 1 to 2. And then once it hits 2, it's going to satisfy this and terminate. So if I run this now, the command that I have here is just to write the for I, the variable that we declared here, and give it write out the value. So if we look down here, we see that it ran 3 times. So it started out at 0, and then it iterated, it ran this command, and then at the end it incremented. And it ran this 3 times, so 0, 1, 2. If I change this to equals, it's going to run this for 4 times. So 0, 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry, yeah. So let's run that. Oops. Uh-oh. I've done something here, and I don't see that bit of code. Let's see what happens here. Okay. Not too sure what happened there. So for PowerShell, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the language, but some languages will allow you to, instead of this way of notating less than or equals to, it could be like this. So for I is less than 2, or less than or equals to 2. And in PowerShell, they use these operations like LE, less than equals. But essentially, the main thing to remember here is that a for loop is telling the program to run a set of commands for a certain number of times. And then you tell it the number of times by specifying a range. So starting at a certain number, and then until you get to a certain number. And you see here we have plus plus, but it could be plus or equals to 2. Or it could be any of those increment or decrement syntax commands that we saw earlier. The other type of loop is a while loop. So a while loop is going to run until a condition is satisfied. So for what that means, I've created a variable called while I, and I've assigned it to 0. And this is going to run while I is less than or equal to 2. Within here, I've written a set of commands. So the first one is to write the output of while I, and then the next one is to increment it. So every time this runs, it's going to increment. So this is going to go 0 to 1 and 1 to 2. So if I run this, I get the output here. So you can see that the end result looks a lot similar to a for loop. But there will be times where you may prefer a for loop, and there'll be other times where you'll prefer a while loop. I will cover some of that distinction in a later session, but just be aware that the slight differences between here. So here I'm telling it the number of iterations, and for here I'm telling it to run potentially forever until this is satisfied. And if this is never satisfied, it will just run forever. So that is something to be aware of, because you may have your program run forever when you actually want it to only run a certain number of times, and it'll just be stuck in a loop. So here we have the if statements, and an if statement is basically an evaluation, and based on the result of the evaluation, execute a command. So here we have if, and the syntax for PowerShell for our equation is parentheses. So we've got our variable here, and we've got our operator, which is equals, and then we've got a value, which is true. So this statement means if this variable equals true, run this command. So we can see that we've set this as true. So it's going to run this command, which will say it's true. So if we hit run, we get this. If we change this to false, it's going to see that this does not equal true. So it's not going to run this command. Then it's going to go on to the next statement. And the next statement is an else if. What this means is that if we don't satisfy the previous command, then try and satisfy this one. And if that is satisfied, then run this command. So if we run this, we should get false. The one thing that I failed to mention previously is command blocks. So in a lot of languages, you can create a command block by using a curly brace. And so a curly brace will tell the program that, for instance, in this case, we're using if, that you have a set of commands. So here we could do and so if we change this to true, then what it'll do is it'll execute this command, and then this command, and then it will stop. And it will actually skip everything else in here and just go on to the next line. So we use the curly braces in order to group commands together. Finally, there's an else statement. And else means that if none of the previous if statements or else if statements have been satisfied, then do kind of like a default. So if I go here and do hi, it's going to go here and evaluate this, and obviously it's not equal to true, so it's going to skip this script block. It's going to go here, and obviously it's not equal to false, so it's going to skip this. Finally, because it hasn't satisfied any of the other ones, it's going to execute this command. And here we are, right host if bool is undefined, and we've got that here. The next way is a switch. And the easiest way to explain a switch is it's quite a lot like if. But if you find yourself writing if statements with a lot of else ifs, then it's a good indication that you want to use switch. And a switch is basically just an easier way to write a load of else if statements. So here we create a variable and give it the value of b. And the syntax for switch in PowerShell is switch, parentheses, and then the variable you want to evaluate. And in here, we're going to have a series of case statements. And what it will do is it will try to match these values to the value of your variable. And if it matches, then it executes the command that you have within your curly braces. So if we run this, we see that it executes this command because b matches the value of switch bar. So it's just like running a series of if and else if statements. We just save a load of typing. So you can see here there's a whole load of text to put, but this looks a lot more cleaner and a lot less typing to write. So that kind of is a quick overview on how to affect the running of your program. So based upon certain things like the values of variables, you can change how your program executes. You can execute some commands or execute others. The other thing that I want to touch on today is functions. And all a function is a way to abstract a bit of work. Now you can write a program without any functions at all. Just as we've done here, we've run this program by writing a bunch of functions. But if we had some code that we wanted to use many times, say we wanted to have some code that writes this output more than once, we could, in the command, in the script, we could go in here and just write, paste that, paste that, paste that, and it will run this command 3 times. But say, for instance, we wanted to change the text here. Oops. Now, if we wanted to change it for all these statements, then that means that we have to go in 3 times and change it. So it's kind of a lot of work. So what you may want to do is, if you have to repeat yourself, it's easier to make a function. So if I go ahead and remove this, so in here I declare a function, and then in PowerShell I write, for the syntax I write function, and then I write the name of my function. Then I have a curly brace, so this will be a script block, meaning that I can execute 1 or more commands, and in here I tell it the command to run. And then the line below, I then write out the name of my function whenever I want to use it. So if I run this, it's going to execute the command that I've written in my function in here. And if I want to run it 3 times, if I run this, it'll run 3 times. Now, if I want to change this here, I only have to change it within the function once. And if I run this, you can see that it's changed for all the times it runs that function. So just to summarize, a function is a good way to wrap up code that you want to repeat multiple times without having to duplicate it. So you just create the function once, and then you call the function any number of times. Some things that you can do with functions is to provide information into the function that will affect how the function works. So what I mean by this, let's use an example. So here I create a new function, so I use the syntax function to create a function, and then I write in the name that I want the function to be called. Then within PowerShell I have syntax called param. And param is what I tell the function to take as an input. So in this case, it's going to take an input of a variable called numThings, which is a type integer. And then I use a for loop, and I'm going to loop from 0 and increment it by 1, so 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, until it's less than or equal to the input of numThings that I put into my function. And it's going to print this statement out every time. So to give you an example, I call my function by writing the name, and in PowerShell I've got a couple different ways to put an input. So in here I have parentheses and 2. So there's only one variable at the moment. I could have more than one variable, but because I only have one, it knows that to take 2, assign it to this one, numThings, and use numThings here. So if I run this, I get this 3 times. So 2 is the max, so it's going to be 0, 0 to 1, 1 to 2. And if I can change this to 4, then you can see it's printed 5 times. So even though we've got 4 here, it's printing at 5 because I'm starting at 0. If I started at 1, it would be 4 items. So the other way in PowerShell to do assign values to function variables or function inputs is to use a dash. And you can see num things here. And I can put that too. And then that's kind of a super quick tour of how to do basics of programming. That's quite common across different scripting languages or compiled languages like C or C++ or Go or Java, things like that. So what I'll do is I'll show you an example of a basic program or a basic script that I've written. What the script will do is it will connect to a vCenter server and it will create a number of virtual machines. So I'll give an overview of what's going on in the script. I'll kind of bring this down here a little bit. And I'll change the font size to make it easier. Okay. So here we have my comments, and I just wrote some stuff to talk about like maybe the name of the script and who was written and when it was written. Here in PowerShell, I tell it to load a library or a module that brings in the VMware PowerCLI PowerShell module. So this means that I can use commands that VMware has written to interact with VMware products. I then go through and I create a series of variables and I assign some information to those variables. This means that if I want to change this, I don't have to go elsewhere in the code and change it. I just change it here once. So what I mean by this is that I have a command called new VM. And new VM tells vCenter to create a VM of a given name on a given host, on a given data store, and then with certain other information like the size of the disk, the size of the memory, the number of CPUs, the network that it should be attached to. And I could have written the name of the VM here. But this means that if I want to change that, I have to come in down here and change this. And if I have, if I want to change this by the program state, I can't because it's static. It's a static value. So if I undo that, okay. I'm going to walk through the flow of the program before I come back to that function. So the flow will start out by writing some text to the command prompt, and it's going to then connect to a virtual infrastructure server. So this is a VMware commandlet that was loaded in that library that I loaded at the beginning. And I tell it to connect to a vCenter server, which I defined at the top of the script, as a user with a given password. So you can see up here, the user is administrator, the password is VMware 1, and the vCenter server is VCSA-01A. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to create a variable called start VM list, and then it's going to run a commandlet called getVM. And getVM talks to vCenter server and gets all of the virtual machines there. And then it's going to assign that list of virtual machines to this variable, so that when I write the variable to the output, I will see a listing of virtual machines in my command prompt. The next thing I do is I call my function, create VMs, and I have a input called numVMs, which accepts the value of 2. So if we go up here, I've declared my function, I've written function, I've written the name that I want the function to be called. Here I specify the number of input variables. So I have one input variable, which is a variable of type integer. It's called numVMs. So when I call this function and I assign it a 2, it means it's putting the value 2 inside this variable. So then I run my trusty for loop, which will increment from 0, 1 at a time, so plus plus, until it's less than numVMs. So in this case, until it's less than 2. The next thing I do is I get creative with how I use variables and types. So for this instance, I want to call my VMs a letter of the alphabet. I'm going to start with A, and I'm going to go on to B and C and D, all that sort of stuff. Now I could create an array and write in the array, so like for instance, I could go type it like that and go through the whole alphabet, but it's a lot of typing and I'm exceptionally lazy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what the ASCII code for capital A is. That happens to be 65. And so I know that 65 is A, 66 is B, 67 is C. So all I have to do is add my looping integer, I, to 65. So in the first case, it's going to be 0. So 65 plus 0 is equal to A. And then the next time the script, this loop runs, it's going to be 1. So 65 plus 1 is equal to 66, which is B. So I'm going to add 65 to my variable, and the result of that, I'm going to cast it, meaning I'm going to turn it from a number into a character. So this is how I convert the ASCII number to the ASCII character, which is A. Then it's going to take the result of that casting and assign it to variable VM name. So then the next bit is to run the new VM, and in name I specify the VM name. In the first iteration it's going to be A, and the next time it runs it's going to be B. Once it runs through the loop the max number of times, it's going to go to the next line, which is the end curly brace, and exit from the function. So when I exit, I run the next command, which is to actually get another listing of VMs. So I should expect to see 2 new VMs here, A and B. And it's going to write that out. Finally, I'm going to do some housekeeping. I'm going to disconnect from the Virtual Center server and write to the output I'm ending my script. So let's go ahead and run this. So you can see here, it wrote out starting script. The next thing it does, whoops, is kind of over the little pop-up window is kind of obscured what's happened here. So it wrote starting script. The next thing it did is it got a list of the virtual machines. So there were 3 virtual machines, Tiny Linux, W12 Core, and Linux Micro. The next thing it did is it ran my function and it created 2 VMs, A and B. And after that, it got another listing of the virtual machines, which is here. So we now have B, A, Tiny Linux, W12 Core, Linux Micro 01, and then it disconnected from the server, wrote to the output ending script, and I put in read host, hit key to end, so that I have to hit some character in order to end the script. So if I look in the vSphere client, I now see A and B. So to kind of prove that this works, let me delete this. And I'll run this again. So here we are, listing of virtual machines, just the 3. Then we added a couple, so now there's 5. And if we go back to the vSphere client, we now have A and B again. So that's just a quick example of a script in action. And so for this session, we just covered the absolute basics that should translate across many languages. And in future sessions, we're going to talk about more complex things such as adding more complex conditionals into the code to change how it works, how to check for errors, and some programming paradigms such as like objects and inheritance and things like that. So hopefully this was helpful, and if you have any questions, just give me a shout and I'll be happy to go into anything. After this session wraps up, I'll send a note to all the members, as we're going to carve ourselves up into groups, and each group will be assigned a language, and from there we'll start creating a project in order to put some of these things that we just learned into practice. So I'll wrap this up for today, and I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. And like I said previously, if you have any questions at all, give me a shout. But hopefully this was helpful for everyone. So thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.